Have you ever thought about time itself, not just, minutes and hours ticking by, but as something imbued with real meaning? What if certain periods became these anchors for history, for faith, identity, carrying this magnified spiritual weight? Well, today we're embarking on a deep dive into exactly that kind of period, the month of Muharram. And this isn't just like the first month of the Islamic New Year. It's really a cornerstone of the Islamic calendar. It's just brimming with layers of religious and historical significance that ripple through centuries. Our mission today is to take the comprehensive analysis you've shared with us, covering Muharram's Quranic roots, authentic prophetic traditions, the different ways it's observed, especially around that pivotal day of Ashura, and just pull out the most important insights. We want to show you why understanding this month is kind of a shortcut to grasping some really deep currents within the Islamic world. And we'll be drawing from a detailed report that meticulously looks at the relevant Quranic verses, hadith with scholarly commentary, and diverse Islamic scholarly perspectives. So when we talk about Muharram being sacred,
is that just a cultural thing that developed over time, or is there something maybe deeper, a divine root?
Oh, it's absolutely rooted in divine revelation. I mean, the foundational Quranic statement on sacred months is right there in Surah At-Tawbah, chapter 9, verse 36. It basically says that since creation itself, God set up 12 lunar months, and out of these 4 are sacred. It's described as this universal, unchanging order. Now, the Quran doesn't actually list them by name, but authentic prophetic traditions and solid scholarly consensus identify them. They are Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hijjah, Muharram, and Rajab.
Okay, and what about that part where it warns, so do not wrong yourselves during them? Does that mean, like, our actions carry more weight in these months?
Precisely, yeah. Classical commentaries, like, the famous Tafsir ibn Kathir, which is this huge work of Quranic interpretation, they make it clear. Sins committed during these sacred months, they carry significantly greater weight. And on the flip side, good deeds, as companions like Ibn Abd pointed out, bring greater rewards. It's like a divine framework meant to guide human behavior, really emphasizing that true faith means submitting to God's decree, even when it's maybe inconvenient.
Right. And the very next verse, Surah At-Tawbah 9.37, seems to really hammer that home. It talks about Nazi, that pre-Islamic thing of moving the sacred months around.
Right.
The Quran calls it an increase in disbelief. Why was just shifting the calendar seen as such a huge deal, such a challenge to God's authority?
That's a really key point. It wasn't just about convenience, for war or trade. Arbitrarily changing sacred months was seen as directly stepping on God's authority over time itself. It challenged divine sovereignty. Actually, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he really underscored this in his farewell sermon. He emphasized restoring the divinely set calendar as, fundamental to real faith.
Okay, so beyond the divine command, there was also a pretty practical reason for these sacred months, especially those 3 in a row, wasn't there? Tell us about that.
Absolutely. The fact that Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hijjah, and Muharram run consecutively, that was divinely designed. It was to make travel safe for pilgrims going for Hajj. They could journey, do their rituals, and head back without the fear of tribal warfare, which is pretty common back then. And Rajab, that single sacred month, sort of in the middle of the year, it served a similar purpose for Umrah, the lesser pilgrimage. It really shows a practical and compassionate side to these divine rules.
So the Quran points to 4 sacred months, but it's the hadith, the prophet's sayings and actions that really nail down the specifics for us, giving us the names. We learn the year is 12 months, 4 are sacred, 3 consecutive, Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hijjah, Muharram, and Rajab Mudar, between Jumada and Shaban. And the name Muharram itself, coming from harama, meaning forbidden or sacred, directly reflects that status. What's the deal with that mention of Rajab Mudar?
That's an interesting historical detail. Rajab Mudar points to the fact that this particular sacred month was strongly associated with the powerful Mudar tribe. That link helped solidify its sacred status even before Islam, kind of ensuring people observed it. But the deeper principle here, is how the Sunnah, the Prophet's way, works. It explains, it elaborates, it gives practical application to the general rules in the Quran. It just highlights that essential complementary relationship between the Quran and the Sunnah. It shows the Prophet's role as the divinely appointed interpreter and guide.
It's fascinating, too, how these hadith also hint at this continuity with earlier divine messages. Like the fact that the Quraysh, even before Islam, apparently fasted on Ashura, maybe inheriting it from Prophet Ibrahim. That tells us something important, right?
It really does. It suggests that Islam didn't just invent these sacred times out of thin air. It was more about purifying them from polytheistic additions and reaffirming their original divine purpose. It's about seeing that thread of continuity with earlier divine messages, showing that core spiritual practices often run deeper than one specific tradition, and Islam came to, well, restore and perfect them.
Okay, so we've established the general sacredness of Muharram, but within this month, there's one specific day, the 10th, called Ashura. It seems to just concentrate an incredible amount of historical and spiritual weight. What makes Ashura so uniquely profound?
Ashura definitely holds a unique place. It's because of this convergence of really significant events. First and foremost, it's remembered for the miraculous salvation of Prophet Moses, peace be upon him, and the children of Israel from Pharaoh's tyranny. The Quran, in Surah Ashura, verses 63 to 68, gives this vivid picture. God inspires Moses, strike the sea with your staff, it parts, saves Moses and his people, and then drowns Pharaoh and his army. Just incredible.
Wow. And it wasn't just Moses, right? I understand other major events are also linked to this day.
That's right. Another significant event attributed to Ashura is when Prophet Nuh's Noah's Ark came to rest on Mount Judi after the Great Flood. That's a narration reported by Imam Ahad. And what's really noteworthy is that both Prophet Nuh and Prophet Musa are said to have fasted on this day as an act of deep gratitude to God for being saved. Attributing these huge universal events to Ashura shows its sanctity kind of transcends any single tradition. It's almost like a universal date marked by divine intervention. A powerful reminder that God's mercy and power have shown up across different prophets and peoples, creating this sort of cosmic story of salvation.
It's also interesting, as you mentioned, that even the pre-Islamic polytheists in Makkah, the Quraysh especially, they also fast on Ashura. The Prophet Muhammad himself did this even before his prophethood. But the actual practice of fasting on Ashura for Muslims, that evolved, didn't it?
Yes, it did. Initially, fasting on Ashura was actually obligatory for Muslims. But then, when the fasts of Ramadan were commanded, that was in the second year after the Hijrah, the migration to Medina fasting on Ashura became optional. Aisha narrated this. When the Prophet arrived in Medina, he saw the local Jewish community fasting on Ashura to remember Moses' salvation. And he affirmed, "We have more right to Musa than you." And he told the Muslims to fast too. But later on, to kind of distinguish the Muslim observance from the Jewish one, he advised fasting on the 9th and 10th of Muharram, that's Tasua and Ashura, or alternatively, the 10th and 11th.
And the spiritual payoff for this optional fast.
It carries a huge spiritual reward. The tradition says it expiates the sins of the previous year.
So a command can actually change over time. That shift from obligatory to optional for Ashura fasting and telling Muslims to do it differently from the Jewish community, that really shows some key principles in Islamic law, doesn't it? Can you elaborate?
Yeah. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, how divine guidance can evolve. The shift from obligatory to optional illustrates naskh, or abrogation basically, a later divine ruling replacing an earlier one. That happens in Islamic law. It also highlights the principle of mukhalafa, or differentiation. It shows Islam making a deliberate effort to establish its own unique community identity, emphasizing its own distinct practices, even while acknowledging, shared heritage.
And beyond Ashura itself, you mentioned the Prophet encouraged voluntary fasting throughout Muharram. Something about it being the best fasting after Ramadan.
That's right. He said, the best of fasting after Ramadan is fasting Allah's month of Muharram. Now, scholars clarify this generally means increasing voluntary fasts during the month, not necessarily fasting the whole thing straight through, but it definitely emphasizes the heightened spiritual reward available in Muharram.
Okay, besides fasting, are there other recommended things to do on Ashura? Maybe something people don't hear about as often?
Well, there's a notable emphasis on being generous towards one's family. There's a hadith that says, whoever provides generously for himself and his family on the day of Ashura, Allah will expand his provisions throughout the rest of his year. Now, there is some scholarly discussion about the exact authenticity level of this specific hadith, but it's interesting that many prominent scholars and early Muslims, like Sufyan ibn Uyayna, actually acted on it. They affirmed its usefulness, saying they saw only good come from it.
That's a very practical application of faith, isn't it? Tying spiritual benefit directly to looking after your family.
It's quite striking, yeah. Even with that bit of scholarly debate, the practice points to this broader Islamic focus on social welfare, on strengthening family bonds. It shows how Islamic spirituality isn't just about individual rituals. It extends significantly into social responsibility.
Yeah.
It's about how your faith shows up in your relationships, in your community.
And generally, throughout Muharram, there's this encouragement for more voluntary worship, like extra prayers, reading Quran, remembrance of God, which is bikri, giving charity, sadaqah, and conversely, extra care to avoid sins, right? Because of those magnified spiritual consequences during sacred months.
Exactly. Increased reward for good, increased seriousness for wrongdoing. It makes it a time for heightened awareness.
So while Ashura carries all this ancient prophetic significance, Moses, that's also perhaps more famously for many today, indelibly linked to one of the most tragic and pivotal events in Islamic history, the Battle of Karbala. It's a story of sacrifice that just resonates so deeply, even now. Imagine this scene, a barren desert plain, Karbala, a small determined group, including the Prophet's own grandson, cut off from water for days, facing this massive army. This was the 10th of Muharram, 61 AH, which is October 10th, 680 AD. The backdrop was the controversial succession of Yazid to the Umayyad Caliphate. He was widely seen as, well, illegitimate and not very pious. Imam Hussain ibn Ali, the Prophet Muhammad's grandson, peace be upon him, he steadfastly refused to pledge allegiance to Yazid, citing his un-Islamic behavior. Encouraged by messages of support from Kufa, though that support later evaporated, Imam Hussain set out with his family and this small band, about 72 loyal companions. They were intercepted by a large Umayyad army at Karbala. Tragically, their access to water was cut off for days. Then, on the day of Ashura itself, despite being hugely outnumbered, Imam Hussain was brutally martyred. His body was mutilated, his head severed. It was just a profound, horrific loss, and it really became a defining moment.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Karbala wasn't just a battle. It was really a fundamental clash over the very nature of Islamic leadership, of governance. Imam Hussein's principled stand against what he saw as impiety and unjust rule, it exposed these deep cracks within the early Muslim community. And it shaped theological, political, and historical stories for centuries after. It became this potent symbol of resistance against oppression.
How do Sunni Muslims generally view this tragedy, and how do they commemorate it?
Sunni Muslims universally see the Battle of Karbala as a profound historical tragedy. There's no question about that. Imam Hussain and his companions are widely revered as martyrs, and Yazid's actions are unequivocally condemned. However, while fully acknowledging Karbala, many Sunnis tend to emphasize the broader historical and prophetic significance of Ashura, focusing more on things like Musa's salvation we talked about. So for them, Ashura remains primarily a day of divine deliverance, gratitude, and these universal lessons.
So their commemoration practices would reflect that broader focus, then, less specific mourning.
Yes, generally. Sunni commemoration typically involves fasting on the 10th of Muharram, often, as we said, paired with the 9th or 11th to differentiate from Jewish practice. The overall tone is usually one of reflection, maybe remembrance, gratitude for God's salvation of prophets, rather than public displays of mourning. They generally don't engage in the specific mourning rituals that are characteristic of Shia observance.
Right, and that raises an interesting point about sticking to tradition. The Sunni approach seems to prioritize these universal narratives and practices sanctioned by the Sunnah, rather than focusing intensely on internal historical conflicts.
Precisely. The Sunni approach tends to prioritize those universal narratives of divine mercy, prophetic continuity, and avoiding certain mourning rituals often aligns with a concern for adhering strictly to practices explicitly found in the Sunnah and avoiding what might be seen as innovations or bid'ah practices without a clear precedent in early Islam.
Okay, now turning to Shia Muslims. For them, the understanding and commemoration of Karbala are very distinct, aren't they? How do they view Imam Hussein's martyrdom?
Yes, profoundly different. For Shia Muslims, Imam Hussein's martyrdom at Karbala is viewed as a supreme, almost divinely ordained sacrifice. It was to prevent the corruption of Islam by tyrannical rulers. He's revered as the Sayyid al-Shuhada, the Prince of Martyrs. And Karbala isn't just history, it's a timeless central paradigm for the struggle against oppression and injustice, always relevant. There's also this concept that seeking justice for Hussein's martyrdom is a key objective linked to the future return of the 12th Shia Imam, Muhammad al-Mahdi.
And how does that deep belief translate into their annual commemoration? It sounds much more intense.
It's an elaborate annual 10-day period of mourning, really building in intensity and culminating on Ashura itself. Pilgrimages to Imam Hussein's tomb in Karbala are considered extremely meritorious, and the actual soil from Karbala, the turba, is believed by many devotees to have miraculous healing properties. People often collect it, use it for prayer or blessings.
And the mourning rituals themselves, you hear about chest beating, maybe other things.
Yes, they are indeed intense. They often involve deep, audible wailing, lamentation, and public expressions of grief, like rhythmic chest beating, known as latmiya. In some regions, you might see practices like self-flagellation, sometimes with chains or knives, although it's important to mention that these specific practices have faced criticism from some Shia religious authorities and have even been banned in certain areas. You also have religious gatherings called mashalis, often held in dedicated centers called Hussainias. There, the story of Karbala is narrated, elegies and poems, Rhoda, are recited, stirring deep emotion. There are also often large public processions. Participants might parade barefoot or lead elaborately decorated horses, Uljana, symbolizing Hussein's horse. And in places like Iran, you see ritualistic passion plays called tatsiya or shabi. In other regions, people might carry replicas of coffins or tombs in processions.
What about fasting on Ashura for Shia Muslims? Is it the same idea as for Sunnis' expiation of sins?
No, it's quite distinct. While some Shia might abstain from food and drink until the afternoon prayer time, Asr, on Ashura, it's generally not viewed as a fast for expiation. It's more an act of empathy, of sharing in the thirst and hunger that Imam Hussain and his family endured during the siege at Karbala.
It's really striking how that narrative of Karbala, of the Imam Hussein's stand, has shaped not just religious identity, but also political movements over time.
Absolutely. It's truly remarkable how the story of Karbala and Imam Hussein's martyrdom has been used so powerfully as a symbol of religious and political resistance against oppression throughout history. It notably inspired movements like the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and continues to inspire groups like Hezbollah.
So fundamentally, these very different approaches to Muharram and Ashura really stem from core theological and jurisprudential differences, don't they? About leadership after the Prophet, the status of the Imams, what forms of religious expression and grief are considered okay.
Exactly. For Sunnis, the focus often leans towards adherence to the broader Sunnah, maybe preserving community unity. For Shias, it's often centered on the injustice suffered by the Prophet's household and upholding that principle of resistance against illegitimate rule.
Okay, moving beyond the sacred status and the intense history of Ashura, Muharram also means something really personal for millions of Muslims. It's the start of the Islamic New Year. It offers this unique moment for spiritual reflection and renewal. Right? Muharram is officially the first month of the Islamic or Hijri calendar. And the calendar itself, its starting point, year one, is the year of the Hijra. That's Prophet Muhammad's crucial emigration from Mecca to Medina back in 622 CE. That wasn't just moving house. It was a massive turning point that led to establishing the first Islamic state. And the decision to actually make Muharram the first month, that came later under the second caliph, Amir al-Mu'minin Umar ibn al-Khattab, around 17 AH. It was decided in consultation with other companions, mainly because it just logically followed Dhul Hijjah, the month of Hajj, sort of wrapping up one major ritual cycle and starting anew.
And it makes you ask, doesn't it? What does a calendar really symbolize? Choosing the Hijra deliberately as the starting point, the epoch, it signifies that the Muslim community's sense of time isn't anchored in, say, a birth or a death. It's anchored in this pivotal moment of collective struggle, migrations, sacrifice, and building a just society. It's a really profound symbol of their historical consciousness, their unique identity.
And as we've said, being one of the 4 sacred months, Muharram is a time when the spiritual impact of everything you do is magnified. Good deeds get bigger rewards, wrongdoing is considered more serious. This acts as a powerful motivator, right, for believers to really step up their spiritual game. We're encouraged to increase acts of worship all through Muharram, extra voluntary prayers, reading Quran, remembering God, giving charity.
Exactly. And this emphasis really positions the month as a kind of spiritual kickoff for the new year. It's meant to foster not just a temporary boost, but long-term spiritual investment, consistency throughout the coming year. Muharram becomes this divinely set period to sort of recalibrate your spiritual compass.
And coming right after the Hajj season ends, Muharram naturally feels like a fresh start. It's a perfect time for Muslims to do a bit of a comprehensive spiritual check-in. Reflect on the past Hijri year, think about how you've grown spiritually, where you maybe fell short, identify areas for improvement. It's really ideal for setting some ambitious spiritual goals, personal resolutions for the year ahead.
And this cyclical structure, it transforms the calendar itself into a tool for continuous self-evaluation, for striving, jihad in its broader sense. It highlights that the Islamic calendar isn't just about tracking dates. It's a profound framework for spiritual accountability, encouraging this proactive, ongoing pursuit of spiritual growth and excellence.
So wrapping this all up, what does this mean for you listening? We've explored the many facets of Muharram, its divine sacredness, the incredibly layered meaning of Ashura, those ancient salvations, and the tragedy of Karbala and its key role as the Islamic New Year.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Muharram acts as this potent annual reminder, a reminder of God's sovereignty, the vital importance of following his commands, and also that enduring struggle for truth and justice we see in the stories. It really calls for a conscious, dedicated effort to step up our worship, to be extra careful about avoiding wrongdoing, and to really internalize its timeless lessons. Lessons of courage, of gratitude, of unwavering faith.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Given the profound emphasis Muharram places on spiritual accountability and making a fresh start, what single new habit or maybe reflective practice might you consider adopting? Not just for this sacred month, but maybe something to carry forward into your entire year, anchoring your own journey in purpose and growth.